So hello everyone, I'm Kylie Alfano and I'm the HR Operations Manager at Tableau. How many of you have seen the Tableau HR 101 either yesterday or last year at a previous webinar? Wow, a lot of you. Well, welcome back. Today's session is a sequel to that 101 story that you guys have all heard, where we're going to dive deeper into 3 examples of how we turn metrics into analytics. So we're going to walk through 3 stories. They're going to be centered around diversity, retention, and recruiting. So a little sneak peek into each one of these stories. The first one is attrition and retention related, where we were seeing a higher turnover rate than we had in previous years. We started digging through the data to try to understand what was going on. I'm going to walk through how we came up with the retention strategy that we implemented midway through this year. The diversity story is really about how we took our diversity data that we developed this year and took it kind of from step 1 of understanding who we are through the process of building out a model to predict who we could become as a company. And then the third story around quality of candidate is how we've taken standard recruiting metrics, which, as you guys have all seen, have been primarily based off of quantity. So number of fills, time to fill, kind of all numbers based, to quality, where we're blending that and balancing that with quality. With each of these stories, I'm going to either do a reverse engineering, or I'm going to do a reverse engineering where I'm going to show you a calculation, a security feature, or some way that we were able to get to that end result. This workbook will be available, so don't worry about like copying down calculations or taking pictures. I also have an appendix with all the calculations at the end that you guys can refer to, so hopefully you too could recreate this if you find it useful. So, disclaimer, this is not our actual data, although these are our actual stories, so don't pay attention to the job titles, etc. The concepts are what we have gone through this year. So let's jump into the first story around attrition and retention. So this first dashboard is going to look familiar to most of you in the room, which is kind of year to date, that high-level snapshot of how our turnover compares to previous years for the company, for departments, and for region. So what we saw earlier this year is 2017 is this dark blue color here. We were seeing higher turnover. So we were hearing from the business units, hey, turnover seems to be picking up. More people seem to be leaving than previous years. So we're hearing stories from people, and the numbers at this high level also showed that. When we looked at it by department, we were kind of able to get a better understanding of potentially was it centered in one department or was this a company-wide problem? And we also looked at it across region. But that was really just the start of trying to figure out what was going on. So from there, we said, okay, well, let's take, a little bit deeper look. This is also going to look familiar to you, where we look at how that compares from a voluntary, involuntary standpoint. At the beginning of the year, we had just wrapped up our performance assessment cycle. So maybe people were leaving who were unhappy with how that performance review came in. Maybe they weren't promoted as they were expected. There could be a number of reasons why people left at the beginning of the year as opposed to at the end of the previous year. And as we drilled in by department, and once again, these aren't our actual departments, we could kind of get a better understanding of what was going on. So here it is by field versus inside, where it appears that inside sales is seeing a big spike here. We could continue to drill down and look at some of the other departments, but this really wasn't providing that view and that insight that we were looking for. But we were from here able to drill down into like a little bit more detail around what department it was coming from. So in today's story, I am going to choose the inside sales team as our example of what we went through. So from here, the question was, are we losing our top performers given start of the year, maybe they weren't our top performers, maybe they were unhappy with how their performance review came in. So we were able to join the data and look at terms versus active and their PA score from that year. And what we found was, across the board, we were not losing our top performers, but we were losing performers across all of our rating scale. So That helped answer that question, but then as you guys all know, one question leads to the next. So that next question was, like, when are people leaving? Are these people that have been here for a long time or a short amount of time? Like, at what stage are these people leaving? So you'll notice here that I have it filtered down to inside. And you can see, nothing really stands out. It's good that people less than a year, most of those were involuntary, probably performance related. But not a lot of insight comes from this dashboard either. So that next question was, well, why then are people leaving? Like, why are we seeing this spike? And we weren't able to answer that question. And the reason why we weren't able to answer it was we were collecting what we called a secondary theme in Workday. But what we found was that for people leaving voluntarily, about 50% were leaving for another opportunity, followed by assignment ended, which generally applied to like our temp positions, followed by personal. And then on the involuntary front, most were performance related, or a few were position eliminated, or a few of these other ones. So when asked, why are people leaving, and you come back with, well, performance, and the people that left on their own left for another opportunity, people look at you like, well, duh, like that's not insightful at all. So we weren't able to answer that question and really provide the insight that the business was looking for. We were, however, conducting exit interviews with each person leaving. However, we were collecting them in forms that were not standard across regions, and different people were asking different questions, and then we were saving each one of these PDFs to individual files. So once again, when asked, it was like, well, we had the data, but we just couldn't summarize what was actually going on. So we thought about what could we do to improve the process, and we took a number of steps. One was we thought about those exit interview themes and what actually made sense for the company. So a lot of them were too close, they didn't make sense, they didn't apply to what we were seeing. So we cleaned up those themes, created some new ones. We created standard definitions of those themes and provided examples for the HR business partners and generalists who were collecting those exit interview notes so that they knew how to capture it in the system. And then we started using Workday, which is our HRIS system, to enter those notes. So we put them into reportable fields that we're now able to pull into dashboards. Once we kind of thought about this process, we did do kind of monthly checkups where we were pulling the data and at a high level looking at, are people using these themes consistently across regions and across departments? So from here, we were able to create new dashboards that really allowed us to answer the question of why are people leaving? So this is kind of one of the simple dashboards that we created, where right now I have it filtered to the inside department. And what you can quickly see is, one, we're using all of the themes, and there's a much more even distribution across why people are leaving. We then break this down by job title. In additional views, we have it broken down by hiring manager, percent of title, like you name it. We are looking at it through this new lens of why are people leaving. In addition to this, you can see high level, kind of how it's spread. But then, as you hover over each one of these, you can read the actual reasons from the notes, so from those fields in Workday, to get that very detailed view of why people are leaving. So when you're asked, like, why did, Bob leave, you could, enter his name in. His box might appear. You could read why he's leaving. Or, oh, I thought that person left for comp. You could look them up and say, no, actually, they were not happy with their job, or they are making a complete career change. So you can kind of have those detailed conversations as well as the high-level conversations. But overall, now that we were able to capture that data in Workday and put it into dashboards, we were really able to get to the bottom of why are people leaving. So in this example, compensation was the number one reason, and that was the number one reason that we were seeing earlier this year for the job that we were looking at. So that next question was, well, if it is compensation, and it did appear that it was kind of mostly in these jobs 1 and jobs 2, are we paying competitively? So we pulled our standard compensation dashboard of looking at our people compared to the market. This probably looks familiar to you guys, of which these dots represent individual people compared to the market. And this kind of helped answer that question, but it's also not clear in this view really what's going on from a compensation standpoint. So from here, we thought, well, there must be a better way to visualize this and to be able to really kind of hit home on, are we underpaid, and if so, by how much? So we built out another view that I think is easier to understand, where we are breaking out by each job, by each location, the percent of people that are below the 10th percentile, below the 25th, below the 50th, and so on. So what you can quickly see here that might have been lost in that previous dashboard was the red versus green of where people are below the 50th or above the 50th. And you could change these colors depending on where your company benchmarks from a compensation standpoint, but this is just kind of how we started looking at it. So in here, it's pretty clear that the red, or being under market, applies to jobs 1 and jobs 2, which is where we were seeing the turnover coming from. So this was great and was really clear in understanding kind of how we compared to market. So from here, the next question was, well, what's it going to cost to bring them up to market? So we built out a dashboard using kind of similar colors based off of the base category, and we built a parameter for comparison. So right now, this is at the 50th percentile, and you could see that if we bring everyone up to the 50th percentile, it's going to cost $1.3 million in this example. And you can see down below where that cost is going to be spent. So you can see if you brought everyone up there, it's going to be mostly concentrated in jobs 1 and jobs 2. As we change this to, let's say, the 75th percentile, you'll notice that certain people went to the other side of this axis here as we were capturing more people, and the cost went from 1.3 to about $3.2 million. So this provided that framework when we were reviewing for kind of what was that cost of if we brought people up to those different market percentages, and who would be affected by any sort of compensation adjustments that we wanted to make. So from here, the next step was, okay, well, this is great. This provides that high-level view, but what does this equate to on a per-person basis? So we broke this down at the employee level, and this is a standard just cross-tab here looking at it, and a lot of times those next steps are done in Excel or done in lists of people, but we took this view and we made it more visually appealing, where we built out a dashboard that looks like this, which is how much will it cost. So in this view, right now I have that parameter set to the 50th percentile, and that total cost, once again, is $1.3 million. You can see here how the cost is going to be spread across those 3 locations, so Austin, Palo Alto, and Seattle, and then by job below, who are those individuals? So in job 1, these one person at the very far left here is going to get an increase of $561, compared to the person who's furthest out of line with market would get an increase of $8,200. So you can see here how that spread is. Well, this was great, and this was a much better start than that crosstab, but that next question as we were sitting in the meeting was, whoa, $1.3 million is a lot more than we were expecting to spend. What if we only adjust this population or that population? And so to be able to quickly answer that question, we started working with sets. So we were able to, the first question was, what if we only captured the jobs where we were seeing that higher turnover? So in this example, we would select jobs 1 and jobs 2 and create a set to figure out, okay, how would that cost go down if we just adjusted the people in those 2 jobs? So from here, when we did that and we created the set, we got a secondary dashboard where you can now see who's in that set versus who's excluded from that set. And you'll notice that the cost went from 1.3 to about $1 million for those in, but that the 2 still add up to that $1.3 million. So that was great. They're like, okay, well, we get that. But the next question is, well, we know in that in-group, we have people that weren't performing, or that maybe they're not our highest performing individuals. Maybe they're the ones that are down here, and they're down here for a reason of which they haven't gotten a merit increase for the past couple years, right? So the next question was, well, what if we overlaid PA score on top of this? So we built out another scenario, which we took our PA score data, we colored it here, and we created two groups, high performers and low performers. So the in, or the green, are the high performers. The red are the people not performing, are highlighted here in red. So you can see here overall, once again, this is at the 50th percentile, that cost and how it breaks down. Well, you know it never stops here, because then there's that next question of, well, what if we only adjust the top performers? You guys know how this goes. Like, you keep getting asked these questions of like, what if? So we created and started combining sets of these different scenarios. And so this is a feature that I'm just going to show you guys how to do real quickly, because it was a really easy way for me to be able to quickly, on the fly, in these meetings, be able to answer those questions. So in this example, I'm going to take this dashboard, and I'm going to duplicate the 3 sheets that are in here. So I have them duplicated here below. And if we go into this cost model 3 detail, you'll notice that this looks identical to the cost model 2. But what I'm going to create here is, we had a set for the entry level and a set for the top performers. So if I highlight those 2 and right click, I can create a combined set. And I might call this, I don't know, top performers and jobs 1 and 2. And then I have options of including members of both sets, or only selecting, members of combined sets, etc. So for this, I'm going to select just the members in both sets. And I've now created a new set. So from here, I can take that new set that I've created, pull it out to color, and you'll see here that the in are the top performers in jobs 1 and jobs 2. I'm going to change the color here quickly so that we don't confuse this with that first cost model. And you can see there. So now if we go to that second sheet, once again, this is that old set color, and I pull in that set that we created. This is now updated. And if I go to that third worksheet, once again, I can pull it in. I'll just hide this. Then I can pull those 3 worksheets into this new dashboard, and you'll notice that the cost went down. Now you could take this and that new set that we created, and now that next question might be, well, we want to make sure we're only adjusting people that have been here for at least a year. Well, once again, you could pull in tenure, add that to that set, and continue with this process to be able to really hone in on just the group of people that you want to make that adjustment to. So sets are a great way, maybe one that you hadn't thought of, to do this kind of on-the-fly modeling really quickly, and also to be able to visually see kind of who's included in that set and who's not. So back to the story. We were finally able to drill down to the population that we wanted to adjust. We made those adjustments, and now it's a matter of going back to those turnover metrics, drilling down and maybe filtering on just Q2 versus Q3 or Q4 versus year to date prior to that, and looking at, have the reasons changed? Are we seeing a change in our turnover numbers, and tracking the progress compared to what we were seeing in the first half of the year? So we're right now on that journey of now tracking progress against the compensation adjustments that we implemented. So this is a great example of how a lot of times you don't know what you need to change in your process or in the data that you have until you start answering questions and really thinking about, okay, what's that next question that they're going to ask? How do we complete that story? And how do you expand on one high-level dashboard that you have and really build out the detail that provides that insight and allows you to be that more strategic business partner to the groups that you're supporting? So the next story here is around diversity. So big topic in the market right now. We started looking at our diversity metrics at the end of last year, and we started with trying to understand who we were as a company. So we built out a series of dashboards, and for today's presentation, I'm going to only focus on the female-male dashboards. But we have very similar looking ones where we're looking at race and ethnicity, age, et cetera. A couple things were really important to us as we were building out these dashboards. One was maintaining the confidentiality of our people. So in all of these, you'll notice that there is our groupings done, and the groupings are done by the business unit level as well as the role level. We've also done groupings based off of, like, for the race ethnicity ones, for when we got down to a specific race or ethnicity where maybe we only have a handful of people. We grouped those into additional classifications to make sure that we weren't able to point out a single person. So we shared this data set that we created with the entire company, and what we wanted to avoid was that one person going, hey, I can pick myself out in this one example, or I know who I am in this one bar chart. So we made sure that we did the groupings in such a way that we were able to maintain the confidentiality of those people. So this is great, and we set the cadence that we were going to refresh the diversity metrics that we created on a quarterly basis. So this helped everyone understand who we were as a company. But from here, it's great, but it doesn't provide that context of how have we changed. So from here, that next step in the evolution of building out these dashboards is really looking at, and I'm going to go back into the presentation mode here, how have we changed? So this is a view where we've now started looking at historically, where have we come from, that helps provide that context of where we are today. So you can see here in this example, we've gone from, at a company-wide, approximately 80-20 to 45-55. So without this historical data of answering that question of how have we changed, it's hard to really put context around who we are today. Well, this is great, and Tableau, like probably most of the companies you guys work for, have changed. So that next question is, well, we can see that we've changed, but why have we changed? So we looked at, how do we think about that question? And what we looked at was, across still that quarterly cadence, why have we changed? So we broke down those numbers into what we called cohort types, where we knew each quarter we had an existing population that continued, but we also had new employees that were affecting the numbers, as well as people leaving. So this is a view where you can see, and once again, this is all fake data here, the females, we've added a bunch, back in 2015, which was contributing to that overall trend of going from 80-20 down to 55-45. We were losing them, now we're not. And it looks like for the male population, they've been more or less stable. In fact, we've hardly had any new or terminations on that front. So by looking at this and really drilling down by business unit and by role level, we can get a much better understanding of if we're changing, why we're changing. Well, then the next question was, well, how could we change? Like, this is all historical, but either, we want to set goals or we want to be strategic about how could we change, at least thoughtful about where we could go from here. So we built out what we call a diversity model, where we looked at female hire rate, female turnover rate, and male turnover rate. And these are all parameters here. And you can see here that currently we're at that 46% female. And this is right now just company-wide, but you could once again add that department filter or whatever else. And as I change these parameters, let's say we change the female hire rate to 70% and the turnover rate to 3%, you can see how we would change 1 year out through, in this example, I have it built out through 2018. So this is a great example of saying, okay, we know we have this existing employee population, we know we have these open positions, but really how much could we actually change? How much do we want to change? So this really helps us be forward thinking around our diversity metrics and where we could go from here. So parameters and this model was a great way to not just look historically about where we've come from. And this example is, female, male, but you could do this to kind of whatever population or kind of whatever group you wanted to do. So it could apply to, veterans or different race, ethnicity classes. You could also apply something very similar to age. I know there was a couple questions from yesterday around retirement age. You could do something similar there where if you looked at kind of a certain age cohort, you could predict out what that might do to affect your population. So in order to create these diversity metrics, I'm going to kind of show you how we structured the data as well as the calculations that went in behind them. So we took 3 data sources. One was our termed employees, second was our current, and third was our open positions, and we did a union to create kind of the full population. We then did a join based off of a quarter table. So you'll notice that in all those examples, I have it broken down quarterly. You could join it to kind of any sort of date table that you guys have. A lot of big companies have one already built out. So whether that be monthly, quarterly, annually, you could join it however you wanted for however frequent you wanted to see that change or that model. And then we took these employees, and the way we joined it was with this calculation so that we were able to now group in kind of for each quarter who fell in to each one of those date timeframes. So when we looked at that first dashboard of how have we changed, you would filter out the open positions because that one was looking historically, and then you'd put that quarter field on columns to be able to take kind of who we are today and spread it across the quarters. For the question of why have we changed, we would keep, once again, the current and the term data. We would filter out the future. And then we created that cohort type calculation, which is essentially looking at start dates and end dates compared to those quarter dates and figuring out who left before that quarter date and who started kind of within that quarter time frame to create those 3 different types of people. And then for the diversity model, once again, you just now want to keep that open data. You want to make sure that that quarter table goes out as far out as you want your model to go out. So if you wanted to go out beyond 2018, you just want to make sure that that goes through 2019 or 2020 or however far out you want it to go. And then you create a series of parameters as well as a series of calculations to figure out how you model those out. So like I said, I have an appendix. I have these nicely laid out for all of you. So you could see exactly how we created all of these if you wanted to write them. You'll notice in here that I have notes. So anytime there's a dash dash and a note, that's kind of why we did what we did. So hopefully that'll provide some additional context for when you want to go back and potentially create these for your company. So know that these will be provided to you. So I really like this example because it shows how you can take one simple dashboard, which was kind of all around like one point in time, one metric of who we are, but that only answers so many questions and provides so much insight about your company. So by asking additional questions, thinking about the data differently, you can gain a lot of new insight. So the journey never really stops, in my opinion, with that one dashboard, but for any dashboard that I create, I can think of a series of follow-on dashboards that provides that additional context and really takes kind of a standard dashboard, which is metrics-driven, into a thoughtful, more analytical type dashboard for the company. So this next story is around quality of candidate. So for those of you who have seen previous examples, recruiting has all been about number of fills. So here are my 6 recruiters that I like to highlight, where you can kind of see how they're doing compared to their goal. In terms of number of fills, we have additional dashboards around time to fill, overall fills, number of open positions, but it's all numbers based in terms of quantity. So from here, and I started getting questions from the recruiting team, specifically around when we were seeing that higher turnover this year, I'm hearing from the hiring managers that there's more turnover on their team. I would like to know, how are my hires performing? Like, is there something I could be doing better as a recruiter to ensure that the people that I'm bringing in, are good quality candidates? So we started with that question of, how are my hires performing? So here are those recruiters. You can see here their total number of hires. And you can see here kind of each of their hires, how do they fall across our performance assessment rating scale? And once again, this is all based off of number of fills. So this is one side of that story. But, where can we go from here? So with each of the dashboards that I create, a lot of times I think about it not just in terms of number, but is there a different way that I could look at this data to potentially tell a different story? So from here, I could change it to %, but you guys probably looked at this and thought, well, that looks almost identical to that previous worksheet that she had up there. And if you combine these two into a dashboard, it might be hard to actually see the difference between number and %. So in this case, kind of the final view was around % on one axis, followed by number on the other. So you can see here in the case of Allison, what you might not have been able to pick out before when we were just flipping between those two worksheets was how that %, varied compared to the total number that she was making. So someone like Allison, who doesn't have very many hires, a lot of them are focused around not good performers. Whereas Michael, on the flip side, he also had a fewer number of fills, but as you can see, as a % of his hires, they're much, much higher. So by providing, not only the number, but the % kind of in one view tells that full story. So when I see a lot of these dashboards, I try to think about how can I visualize both views in a way that tells the full story, not just one side of the story. So another dashboard that we could provide is, why are my hires leaving? So once again, we could group this, we could look at this. We found that not just providing the data around why are they, or how are they doing once they're here, but why are they leaving, especially around poor job fit or culture not a fit, or some of those other categories where they might be able to learn from those examples and maybe bring in a different type of candidate or work with the hiring manager in a different way was important. So all of this is great, and creating all these dashboards is great, but a lot of times we get stuck with creating them and not knowing how to share them in the right way. So I'm going to exit out of here and show an example of how we're able to provide this data to the recruiting team using Tableau Server. So in this example, we have the 6 recruiters here, but the 6 recruiters aren't actually people at Tableau. So in order to do this demo, I actually have to make 2 of them actual Tableau users. So I'm going to change Allison to Ashley Howard. She's aware that I'm using her name for this demo. And I'm going to make Michael, who's the top performer, myself. All right, so I changed those 2 usernames. So the first, and you'll notice here that I'm signed in as myself. I'm going to switch to Ashley partway through this demo. So in this example, the first step would be to create this server username, of which this is just saying, okay, call out and look at this username in these calculations. So that's step 1. Step 2 is to create an email alias for each recruiter. So kind of 3 options here. One is ideally it's supplied by the database, but we all know that that's most of the time, or a lot of the times, might not actually be there. So maybe you have their full email, such as Kylie Alfano at Tableau, of which you want to break that at that ampersand symbol and just include the K Alfano. Third option would be you don't have it in there at all, and you're not able to modify anything. So you could write a case statement so that when the recruiter is Ashley Howard, this would be the email alias. So kind of 3 options to be able to get that email alias into the data set that you guys are working with. Once you have that email alias created, you want to create that user filter. So if we drill into that, you will see here, option 1 would be for that server username, which is kind of what I'm signed in below, to equal that email alias. But that's only going to show like for Ashley, Ashley's hires, or for Kylie, Kylie's hires, or if they're, if you're someone like Bob signing in, it's going to show blank. But in a lot of times we want to actually have an admin override or like a manager override so that they can see the full data set. So in this case, we've written a statement so that if the username is Kylie Alfano, so in this case I was Michael, I'm going to be Michael who's a manager, and I'm going to say, let's say Adam Slipsky, who's our CEO, also wants to be able to view all this data, so I'm going to provide him with an admin override. Else, we're going to provide that email alias. So now we have 2 admins who can see that full data set. So if I pull in user security here, you can see here, I'm signed in as myself. So my user security here that I pulled in here is showing true. But as I sign into, hold on. Right, I know, who's excited for it, right? Here we go. So as I sign in with Ashley, and they gave me a heads up that a bunch of people are demoing, and so the internet might be slow. So as I sign into Ashley, you'll notice, because I didn't add her as an override, she's showing true, and everyone else is showing false, right? So we know, and as you're building this out, it's always good to test it just to make sure that the calculations that you're writing are actually rendering what you intend for them to come up with. But now, if we just stopped here and we filtered on true, Ashley would only be able to see Ashley's row, which is great, other than that next question generally is, coming from Ashley, well, this is great. Well, how do I compare? Like, this is, like, am I in line with everyone else or not? So with that case, you can create this final step with this recruiter with other. And so this is one of those calculations that I love, which is if that user security is true, in this case it's Ashley, show the recruiter name, otherwise populate other. So if I pull this in here, recruiter with other, I can see for Ashley it shows Ashley, and then other for those others, which is great. So now she can see that context. And I'm still signed in as Ashley, as you guys note. And now if you were to pull out user security and recruiter, however, you'll notice that it's grouping them, which now isn't showing the data how we want it to show. So I'm going to back up here. And the reason why I showed this is it's always helpful to just hide so that it keeps that. Oops. So now Ashley can see her data, and everyone else is rendering other. So this can apply, whereas if I log in to myself, what you'll see there is all of those names, because I put myself as that admin override, is showing in. I'm now able to see all those recruiter names. So this is a great way, and this is a technique that we have found is a great way to be able to share data not only with the person, but also be able to provide that context of how they compare to everyone else. So like an example yesterday where I showed that PA scale distribution, that's a great example of where it's one thing for them to see the scale or the distribution for their team, but generally they want to know how they compare to everyone else. And so by doing something similar on the security front as this, you could provide that context without revealing which group is which. So this is a trick that we use a lot to make sure that we are providing the context, but also maintaining the confidentiality of the data that we are sharing with everyone.
Kylie, you can put that steps you're doing in your slides too.
That is correct. So also in an appendix here, we have the calculations for the recruiting security. So step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4. So yep, those are all in there for you.
Yeah, because you're doing something a little bit differently than I've done.
Yeah. So that is great. Okay, so with that, these 3 examples really showed how at Tableau we're continuing to take our dashboards and evolve them and iterate on them based off of business needs and additional questions that come up. It never really stops with that single dashboard. And it's amazing how when you continue to build out those additional dashboards, you're able to understand like an entirely new platform of knowledge about your people that maybe you didn't know existed. So it starts with that one question, and that one question starts that journey. So I hope all of you have gotten something out of today's session that you can take back that would start that, additional journey for you. So with that, we are going to open it up for Q&A. Questions? Yeah. Oh, you want to go? Oh. You want to go first?
So, with the user filter that you showed, what if we don't want to show each, others? What if we want to aggregate it to what you had before, but instead of what it is that calculating the average, or is that how?
You could write another calculation that would either add in the average or the sum, or however you wanted to do that, depending on how you wanted to look at that. Or you could create a secondary dashboard that would pull it in that way. So there would be a number of different ways that you could do that. So we've kind of done it both ways. Sometimes it's important to see that row level detail, while other times you do want it aggregated up.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Next question?
So when you're looking at the recruiter's performance, you're looking at the number of hires versus peer ratings. What if in your organization, hypothetically, the annual performance ratings are flawed? They don't typically.
Yeah.
Hypothetical case here, right? What would be other metrics to look at in terms of knowing how are you recruiting on the quality candidate, or how do you measure performance potential both at the same time?
So I think it would depend on, do you guys do employee engagement surveys of which you could benchmark someone, even providing that context. So in a lot of times, our calibration of score might not be perfect. We don't have a forced distribution curve. So in sometimes you could provide context of, that compared to the region so that you can kind of get an understanding, or maybe we'd provide some additional detail to provide the context for why maybe they're skewed to the left or to the right, but providing that might be helpful. Survey data, tenure, why they're leaving. If you have any 360 feedback that you can summarize, I think it would depend on kind of what you're collecting about your people. You could look at performance over time. Yeah.
The thing is that with forced distributions, it's still not a good measure to know who are your top candidates.
Right.
And then, measuring the recruiters on that. So I was trying to think what else we measure.
Do you do other employee surveys?
We do.
Yeah. You might want to look at seeing if you can pull anything out of that. Or even pulling at a group level. If you can't break down the employee surveys on a person level, even sharing it at the group level or the department level might provide some insight back to the recruiting team. Question?
You mentioned that this is Workday data that you're getting.
This.
How do you connect directly into Workday? Our company is moving towards Workday, and is there a connection into Workday that Tableau does? Do you have to get reports out, and do you do it, or does IT do it?
So a lot of this data comes out of Workday. So we use Taleo for our recruiting data, Workday for our HRIS system data. So we do a combination of Alteryx, of pulling data out, kind of at a scheduled base, which feeds to a employee master. So that's reconciled once a week, which provides all those transaction level details. And then a lot of times we'll pull individual reports out of Workday. Alteryx is our way of being able to self-serve and schedule those reports to come out as opposed to relying on our IT team. So that's great. We basically create reports in Workday, enable them to be run as a web service, and can pull them down. But for Taleo, we have a typical kind of ETL process set up that refreshes every 30 minutes. So I know companies that have done it both ways. Question?
If you share these dashboards and they start creating their own versions, how do you go about version control?
So we will, a lot of times we'll publish these. So like with the diversity metrics, we wanted to make sure that people were not editing those. So when I published those to server, I actually only allowed users to be able to view them and not even web edit them. So it kind of depends on the dashboard, how sensitive it is, and how broadly we're sharing it to determine whether I let people view, edit, interact, or change it.
If you do allow them to make their own copy,
Yep.
how do you mitigate the version control in that case?
A lot of times we just let them, ideally they have access to the data from like a database perspective. So no matter what, they could kind of control however they want to see it. And generally they'll come back to me and say, hey, I saw this additional insight, or I'm looking at it this way, or is this correct? So generally I'm in contact with whoever's kind of doing it on their own, and I'm able to control it that way. But we don't have a great way about really being able to see who is doing what with the data. But we make sure that they have access to the underlying data to make sure they're not playing with data that they shouldn't have. Mm-hmm. Question?
You mentioned data privacy for the individuals. So as you currently were reporting only to human resources and top leadership, you roll out to business units, do you have guidelines, or do you only report if there's 5 individuals in a category or something like that?
So we, like on the turnover metrics, like a lot of times with like, we want to make sure that like when people are doing the exit interviews, they know that what they're sharing might not be shared exactly with their managers. Otherwise they might not say everything that they would normally say. So generally with the detail of like those exit interview notes, we would remove that field and just provide, like generally you as a hiring manager are losing people because they're dissatisfied with their manager, right? But we wouldn't give them that exact detail by person for who is saying what, whereas we might at like the VP level, because maybe we have a problem with that hiring manager. Or sometimes with the recruiting team, maybe they can't see the individual candidate data, we'll pull that detail off, but they could see the aggregate. So it really depends on level, but generally we kind of draw the line at the VP level. Does that help?
Not really.
Okay. If you have an individual example, do you want to take it offline after?
Sure.
Okay. Let's get through questions and I can come back to you.
So you mentioned this earlier. A lot of our data for capturing turnovers and people leaving is open text. So you give the example that the forms were different.
Yep.
We don't have like a drop down kind of a thing. It's more like whatever somebody said, the recruiter or whoever in the exit interview, they would type it in.
Yep.
And it's hard to kind of figure out from there what the reasons were.
Yep.
I really like the tooltips where you show the exit interview. Do you have any examples of like a sentiment analysis or something? I heard that there was another presentation I went over where they showed like a warm sentiment versus like a hot sentiment or something. Is that something that you have done or an example? In general, what people are leaving, what are the sentiments, what are, some sort of open text analysis.
So I think the person who did that one was doing that with Tiny Pulse data that they were getting back.
Okay.
Was that a Tableau example?
I wasn't there, somebody was telling me that much yet.
Okay, I think they're doing that. I know they're doing that right now with the Tiny Pulse for our tech ops group. Is that?
They did a word cloud as well.
They didn't a word cloud?
Yeah, it was email data, it was words from emails, and they did a sentiment analysis over time.
Okay.
That's interesting.
You could also use Python as text analytics.
But when we look at our, overall, when we look at our exit interview themes, it's pretty easy and we could change the colorings for were they leaving, were they unhappy when they were leaving or were they happy when they were leaving, you know what I mean? So we can look at it. We have standardized the questions to try to make sure we're being as consistent as possible, but we haven't started going down that route yet. Yeah. Cleaning up the data and making sure we were capturing it consistently was kind of the first step. But I imagine, the journey never stops where we are now. So that probably will happen over the next year or something similar to that. Question?
One thing that makes Tableau, I think, such an inspiring company is its commitment to excellence. Like we were seeing in the keynote the other day, it's not even about what everybody else in the game is doing and are we better than them. It's about providing the highest quality experience to the end user. And I was wondering, how does this company commitment to excellence inform HR's approach to diversity and recruiting?
So let me think about that answer here for a second. So I think one of the things that I love about Tableau is we always want to make sure that we have the best the best employees that represent our values, which is like we're honest, we're open, we're transparent, we use our product, we're on a mission, right? So we want to make sure that we're not hiring just to hit goals that are artificial and that are just set out because we want to say that we're at 50-50 or we want to say that we're ahead of the market. So I think one of the ways that we do that, like in the light of diversity, is saying like, as opposed to setting an unrealistic goal, setting the goal of like, how have we changed, why have we changed, and understanding that with the overall goal of knowing that with diversity comes diverse thoughts and a better employee base, but not setting artificial goals was one of the things that I loved when we started looking at it that I think a lot of companies are doing. Does that kind of provide an example?
Yeah.
Okay. Question?
Compensation example, when you're sharing, like the Brennan minimums as an example, like structure for a set level employee, when you're sharing this with like your HR directors through Server, how are they able to see the employee level detail? Because that is the we do it. Like, this is great summary data, but we need to see, row by row employees and exactly who's impacted and what about that. How do you do that when you're sharing the summaries on Server? Do you then supply the employee level detail through Server as well, or does
So
it
with
go through the system or some Excel?
So if something is confidential where we were doing, compensation adjustments, which is highly sensitive, I would not actually publish those dashboards to Server. So if we were looking at that from like a HR standpoint only, we have shared LAN files with limited admins where I would share and save exact workbooks for, the EMEA region versus the APAC region versus maybe a certain group, or I'm having meetings with them. So I will take out that employee level detail if I were to publish it. But generally with something like that, we can get around it because I'm able to scale and, share that data with them. But we're really careful about not sharing that level of detail on Server. Question?
Kind of to answer your question though, people are all set up to what they can see. The user example that you were doing, something you were doing, I do it to that detail. Say like, let's say you're in Department 101. I can do everything 101, but I can't see 102. My security is set up, so I only get to see the one that I need to see.
Right.
For the entire listing of,
Right. So
done that across the board.
and we can do that too. However, we do have server admins. So depending on how many server admins you have, which I imagine that's who you're trying to keep the data out of, you wouldn't want them seeing the employee level detail. Do you guys work with that at all?
I am the only Tableau admin.
Oh, you are? Okay. Oh, so you're unique. Yeah. We have people in the IT team that have access that we try to,
High level security, so
yeah.
that's a little bit different at that point, but I also am very cognizant of what you're saying
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
I take what you through the security down to another level, so when you log in, it's up to the goals that you have as an administrator.
But a lot of companies actually have their own.
Still Kylie down here, I can go through and filter on every person to see what I can see.
Yeah. But a lot of companies have their own HR server with maybe just one admin to make sure that they could share. So that's what I've seen a lot of companies do. We're not quite at that point yet. So any questions from over here? No? One in the back?
I have two questions. First one is, how do you define top performer and low performer in your database? Like, is it just based on performance rating?
So for this example, yeah, I did it based off of performance rating, but you could do performance rating averages over the last certain years. If you have an overall number plus subcategories, you could kind of do it however you wanted. For this, I just did those 2 groupings.
Okay, so I'm assuming you, most of the industry follows a bell curve kind of thing where 3 would be the average. If it's a scale of 5, so do you consider, so do you ignore that 3 or do you include 3 top performers?
Oh.
That's a major population.
Yep.
I don't know if you can ignore that.
So like when we were actually going through this example, I started with not just grouping green and red, high versus low, but actually looking at across all PA ratings so that we could select in that meeting, what if we included 3s, what if we excluded 3s, and then that kind of helped define who we wanted to adjust. So it varies by group. We don't have a standard definition, but a lot of times if I was actually doing that modeling, I would provide models with kind of different breaks at different levels. So there's not just a clean break, because sometimes we would include them, sometimes we wouldn't. Then it would also depend on like how far out of line are we with the market with them? Is that where we're seeing the turnover? Like it's kind of there's a lot that goes into it. So generally I have more models and more kind of scenarios laid out ahead of time.
One more.
Okay.
Little bit related to it, but do you guys do anything with quality of hire metric, or do you guys measure something?
For
Single metric or quality of hire?
No, we try to stay away from like single numbers, because a lot of times there's too many assumptions that go into like quantifying someone as like a 1 versus a 2. So a lot of times it's like, okay, you need to see the full context and the full story. Otherwise, it's easy to group people into a box where maybe there's more to them than just being grouped as a 1. So we try to avoid kind of single scores. I know a lot of people are trying to figure out what that single score is for quality candidate out there. We're not even going down that path. Question?
The quality of hire, we have kind of one slice of traditional kind of view of quality of hire looking at performance. What are other factors to consider?
So quality of candidate is like a path that we're just starting down. So this is kind of the start of our journey. So we are looking now at providing back like interview data. Like how did the interviewers rate them? How could we pull that in? The engagement kind of year over year performance of, is it going up? Is it going down? Promotion rates could go in there for how they're doing. There's a number of different factors that we could start pulling in now. But this is kind of just the start of our new journey.
Are you capture cost of hire?
Cost of hire data? We do capture cost of hire data.
Where do you get that from?
So we get that from our finance team. So we look at it, we actually look at the recruiting costs, and we do much more probably standard cost to hire metrics around, the salary and the benefits of the recruiting team, 401k, ESPP, down through recruiting events, agency fees, et cetera. And then we kind of break it down on those categories, see how it trends over time by business unit for what's hitting the recruiting team, so like what we're absorbing, versus kind of also what's hitting the other departments for what they're absorbing. And then we model out, like, if we were to continue to hire at this rate and the costs were to stay here, here's what it would be. But that's really helpful because a lot of it goes into like the budget for the next year.
Yeah.
And like forecasting out, like, okay, how much do we need to put into the recruiting budget for next year? A lot of that's based off of the cost per hire metrics that we have.
Yeah, we did an analysis where, it's one thing hiring somebody out of college, but I'm a biopharma and, sometimes we go and hire doctors and they leave after like 8 months.
Right.
And that cost of hire is ridiculous, to just, get them on board. And when they leave, it has a huge impact. But it's always been a struggle to get that in one place.
Right.
That's a good idea, like, with finance process and get it all in one place.
Yeah, so that's how we're doing it.
I have a general question, higher level. Have you been able to influence policy decisions based on kind of the data? I was thinking more about diversity, and you showed one data where you had a lot of female exits for like 2 or 3 quarters, and then kind of stopped. And it sounded like, I don't know if it was like a policy thing or what happened. I don't know real data.
Yeah.
If you saw something like this, have you had success having a conversation on a policy level with the upper management? How's that experience been? If you can share something like that.
So we're not a huge policy company, just to be, completely transparent. But we have been able to impact the direction of like our compensation philosophy and where we want to benchmark and how we're thinking about like merit increases, equity, and kind of other programs that we're rolling out. Yeah, we've been for sure kind of the forefront of using data to inform a lot of the people decisions that we're making. Or for example, we did a benefit survey this summer, and from that we were able to shape kind of what we want to put into our 2018 benefit offerings. So a lot of times we're using this data to kind of shape how we want to treat our people, think about our people, and do for our people. So for sure, like without this data, like a lot of the decisions and what we have in place right now probably wouldn't be there.
Are there usually like a lot of follow-up questions where you go back and bring more data in, or is there more like something like this where you package it and present it and
I've gotten better and better at it over the 4 years I've been at Tableau. So it started with the first, which is like one dashboard, but then there was that follow-on question. So I try to think now, anytime I do a dashboard of like the who, what, where, why, how could this be broken out? So I try to get in front of it, which I find to be really helpful. So I've gotten better and better at it, and generally now I kind of know what they're looking for and what they're going to ask to come up with it. I also find that by doing a story and by presenting it, a lot of times you can get in front of like them jumping ahead and wanting to ask a question. But I make sure that I'm providing that full context, or as much context as possible, from enough different angles so that they don't have as many questions to follow up on. But, yeah. Question?
Yeah, just do you have any luck with predicting more predictive analytics, like weighing out the cost of new hires versus experienced hires, since you have some of your hiring and turnover costs modeling any of that out?
We have not yet modeled any of that out. Yeah. But we probably should, and we probably will over the next couple of years, so stay tuned. So I think we are almost out of time. Or I think we are out of time. I was getting the signal from the back door. There is an HR lunch meetup downstairs in the Data Village. So if you guys want to network more, I will be there, as well as some of the other members of my team. So thank you all. And if you have other questions, or like I know you had a follow-up question, I can also talk to you in the hallway right afterwards.